The Christmas Truce of 1914, when enemies became brothers in no man's land. Imagine hell on earth, muddy trenches, constant artillery fire, rotting corpses, and the certainty that tomorrow might be your last day. Now imagine that on Christmas Eve, your mortal enemies begin singing carols, and then, impossibly, they invite you to play football. On December 25th, 1914, something happened on the Western Front that High Command tried desperately to suppress, that military historians still debate, and that challenges everything we think we know about war, hatred, and human nature. It wasn't a battle. It was the opposite. For one brief, impossible moment, soldiers from opposing armies did the unthinkable. They stopped trying to kill each other and celebrated Christmas together in the blood-soaked wasteland between their trenches. This is the true story of the Christmas Truce, one of the most extraordinary events in military history, and one that the powers of Europe would ensure could never happen again. The darkness before Christmas. By December 1914, the Great War, the conflict we now call World War I, was supposed to be over. When fighting erupted in August, politicians and generals on all sides confidently predicted their boys would be home by Christmas. Kaiser Wilhelm II told his troops they'd return before the leaves fall from the trees. They were catastrophically wrong. Instead of a quick, glorious victory, Europe had descended into a nightmare unlike anything in human history. The Western Front, a 475-mile scar running from the North Sea to the Swiss border, had become a static killing field. Millions of men from Britain, France, Belgium, and their allies faced off against German forces across a devastated landscape of mud, barbed wire, and death. The trenches were hell. Soldiers lived in waterlogged ditches, often standing in mud up to their knees or even waists. Rats, some as large as cats fattened on corpses, infested every position. Lice tormented the men constantly. The stench of death, human waste, and rotting sandbags was inescapable. Disease ran rampant. And every day, artillery shells and sniper bullets claimed more lives. By mid-December, hundreds of thousands were already dead, with nothing to show for it but a few hundred yards of destroyed farmland. The trenches on both sides were sometimes separated by as little as 50 yards, close enough to hear the enemy coughing, talking, or screaming when the shelling started. The men in those trenches were mostly volunteers or conscripts who had enlisted with patriotic fervor, believing they were defending their homelands. But after months of industrial slaughter, many were beginning to ask themselves, who exactly was the enemy? Silent Night, in multiple languages, December 24th, 1914, was cold and clear along much of the Western Front. As evening fell, something unexpected began to happen in the British and German trenches near Ypres, Belgium. British soldiers in the front lines near the village of Fleurbay first noticed small lights appearing along the German trenches, then more lights. Within an hour, the German parapets were decorated with hundreds of small Christmas trees. Tannenbaum, a cherished German tradition. The trees had been sent from Germany as gifts to the troops, along with packages of food, cigarettes, and letters from home. Then came the singing. German voices rose from the opposing trenches, carrying across no man's land, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night, one of the most beautiful and peaceful songs ever written, drifting across a landscape of death. British soldier Graham Williams of the London Rifle Brigade later wrote, "First, the Germans would sing one of their carols, and then we would sing one of ours, until when we started up 'O Come All Ye Faithful,' the Germans immediately joined in singing the same hymn to the Latin words Adeste Fideles." And I thought, well, this is really a most extraordinary thing. Two nations both singing the same carol in the middle of a war. Along other sections of the line, similar scenes were unfolding. Near the Belgian town of Plugsteert, known to British soldiers as Plug Street, German soldiers began shouting Christmas greetings in broken English. "English soldier! English soldier! Merry Christmas! Where are you from?" Some British soldiers shouted back, cautiously at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Men who hours earlier had been trying to kill each other were now exchanging pleasantries across the blasted earth between them. Then came the most audacious suggestion. "You no shoot, we no shoot." Dawn in No Man's Land. What happened on Christmas morning 1914 wasn't uniform across the entire Western Front. In some sectors, the fighting continued as usual. In others, there was merely an informal ceasefire. No shots fired, but no contact either. But in dozens of locations along the line, something truly miraculous occurred. German soldiers began emerging from their trenches, hands raised, shouting, "Nicht schießen!" Don't shoot. After a moment of stunned disbelief, British and Belgian soldiers began climbing out as well. Within minutes, the space that had been certain death just hours before, No Man's Land, was filled with enemies meeting as friends. They shook hands. They exchanged gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, buttons cut from uniforms as souvenirs, addresses to write to after the war. They showed each other family photographs. German soldiers who spoke English acted as translators. A few men pulled out bottles of alcohol they'd been saving and shared toasts. Then they began helping each other bury the dead. Bodies had been lying in No Man's Land for weeks or even months, impossible to retrieve under normal circumstances without getting shot. Now British and German soldiers worked together to give these men proper burials. Joint funeral services were held, with chaplains from both sides reading prayers. Men who had killed each other's comrades stood together with bowed heads, united in grief. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann, a German officer, later wrote, "The English came out of their trenches and met us halfway. The first English soldier I met extended his hand and said, 'Good morning, I hope you are well.' There was not a sign of resentment or bitterness. The football match that stopped a war. The most famous incident of the Christmas Truce, though disputed by some historians, was a football match played in No Man's Land. Lieutenant Kurt Zamisch of the 134th Saxons recorded in his diary, "The English brought a soccer ball from their trenches, and pretty soon a lively game ensued. How marvelously wonderful, yet how strange it was. The English officers felt the same way about it. Thus Christmas, the celebration of love, managed to bring mortal enemies together as friends for a time." Multiple accounts mention football being played, though the details vary. Some describe organized matches with makeshift goals. Others mention soldiers simply kicking a ball around informally. The most documented game took place near Plugsteert, where British and German soldiers played until the ball was punctured on barbed wire. The score? According to one German participant, Germany won 3-2. According to British accounts, it was a draw. Perhaps both are right. Different games at different locations. Or perhaps in the fog of memory and the desire for narrative satisfaction, the score matters less than the fact that it happened at all. Think about that for a moment. Men who had been ordered to kill each other, who had watched friends die horrible deaths at each other's hands, were playing football together, not because officers commanded it. Many officers were horrified by what was happening, but because the soldiers themselves chose humanity over hatred. The aftermath and the cover-up. The Christmas truce lasted 1 day in most places, 2 days in some, and nearly a week in a few sectors. But it couldn't last forever. Eventually, reality reasserted itself. In some cases, officers ordered the fraternization to stop. In others, the artillery started up again, often fired from rear positions by officers who hadn't participated in the truce and were horrified by reports of what was happening. Some soldiers later reported that the first shots were deliberately aimed high, warning shots to end the gathering rather than to kill. Getting the men back to fighting was difficult. Lieutenant Sir Edward Halls, who had participated in the truce, wrote to his mother, "I wouldn't have missed that unique and weird Christmas day for anything. We are not at all friendly toward one another now." But that last line wasn't entirely true. Even after the truce ended, many soldiers found it psychologically difficult to return to killing men they just shared chocolate and songs with. In several sectors, an informal understanding persisted. No one fired unless fired upon. The concept of live and let live took hold in parts of the line where both sides tacitly agreed not to press attacks too vigorously. High command on both sides was furious. British Commander-in-Chief Sir John French issued strict orders that any further fraternization would result in court-martial. The German military leadership did the same. Officers who had allowed the truce faced career consequences. The British press initially reported the truce with enthusiasm, seeing it as evidence of British superiority and good sportsmanship. But military censors quickly clamped down, concerned that such stories would undermine fighting spirit. The message from leadership was clear. This must never happen again. And it didn't. By Christmas 1915, the war had grown even more bitter. Poison gas had been introduced. The casualties had mounted into the millions. The men in the trenches had seen too much death, too much horror. The humanity that had briefly emerged on Christmas 1914 was buried under a year of mechanized slaughter. What it meant and why it matters. The Christmas Truce of 1914 remains controversial among military historians. Some see it as evidence that the common soldier never truly wanted the war, that if left to their own devices, men would choose peace over violence. Others argue it was merely a brief aberration, made possible only because the war was still relatively young and the worst atrocities hadn't yet occurred. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The Christmas truce was real. We have too many letters, diaries, and photographs to doubt it. But it was also limited. It didn't happen everywhere. Some soldiers refused to participate, remaining loyal to their duty even on Christmas. And crucially, when the truce ended, the war continued with undiminished ferocity. Yet the very fact that it happened at all challenges our assumptions about warfare and human nature. These weren't peaceniks or conscientious objectors. They were soldiers, men who had volunteered to fight, who believed in their causes, who had already killed enemy soldiers. If these men could see their enemies as fellow humans, even briefly, what does that say about the nature of hatred and conflict? The Christmas Truce also reveals how much modern warfare depends on dehumanization. Generals understood instinctively why the fraternization had to be stopped. Once you've sung carols with a man, shared his cigarettes, seen photos of his children, it becomes much harder to shoot him on command. Military effectiveness requires emotional distance from the enemy. The Christmas truce shattered that distance, and from high command's perspective, that made it dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than enemy bullets. Echoes across time. The Christmas Truce of 1914 has inspired countless retellings, songs, films, plays, and books. The most famous is probably the 2005 film Joyeux Noël, which dramatized the events. In 2014, on the centenary of the truce, memorial services were held along the former Western Front, with descendants of soldiers from both sides meeting in remembrance. Perhaps most poignantly, there's a memorial near Ploegsteert, a cross bearing the inscription 1914, the khaki chums, Christmas Truce, 1999, 85 years, lest we forget. Near it, you can still walk the reconstructed trenches and stand in no man's land, now peaceful farmland. But the most important legacy of the Christmas Truce isn't commemorative, it's cautionary. The truce represents a fork in the road not taken. What if the soldiers had refused to resume fighting? What if the spontaneous peace had spread along the entire front? Could the war have ended in 1914, saving millions of lives? We'll never know. The moment passed. The war ground on for 4 more years, ultimately claiming approximately 20 million lives. The world that emerged from the Great War was darker, more cynical, and more willing to embrace totalitarian ideologies. The path from the trenches of 1914 leads eventually to the even greater horrors of 1939 to 1945. The Christmas Truce reminds us that another path was possible, however briefly, however imperfectly. It shows us that even in the midst of hell, humanity can assert itself, that soldiers ordered to be enemies can choose to be brothers, that the ties that bind humans together, love of family, appreciation of beauty, the simple desire to live, can be stronger than the propaganda that divides us. The question that remains: every Christmas, we celebrate peace on earth and goodwill toward men. We sing Silent Night and O Come All Ye Faithful, the same songs that rang out across the trenches in 1914. We exchange gifts and share meals with loved ones, grateful for another year of life. But do we remember the men who did those things in the worst possible circumstances? Who created a moment of peace in the middle of mechanized slaughter? Who proved that even war cannot entirely extinguish the human capacity for compassion? The Christmas Truce of 1914 asks us a question that remains urgent today. If soldiers in trenches could overcome their hatred and see the humanity in their enemies, why can't we? If men who had every reason to hate each other could share Christmas together in no man's land, what excuse do we have for the divisions that plague our relatively peaceful world? The answer matters because the alternative, the path actually taken, led to unimaginable horror. The soldiers who played football on Christmas Day 1914 were back to killing each other by the new year. Most of them didn't survive the war. Their moment of brotherhood was brief, fragile, and ultimately futile. But it happened. Against all odds, against all orders, against all logic of war, it happened. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the message isn't that peace is easy or automatic, but that it's always possible, that even in our darkest moments, we can choose humanity over hatred, brotherhood over violence, hope over despair. Every Christmas, we should remember the men who made that choice in 1914 and ask ourselves if we have the courage to make it too.